Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's episode of A New Thing. I'm excited to be here, and today we're going to be talking about something that's a little spicy, a little political. Although I'm actually going to shy away from, well, hopefully, shy away from that as much as I can. I really want to talk more about the ethics of it, more than anything else, because this actually correlates pretty well with kind of just Christian ethics and thinking about Bible theology in the sense of like how I like to speak about it, which is data gathering, making sense of the data that the Bible gives us. That's kind of the theology when it's done very well. And theology, when it's not done very well, doesn't take into a full count of it. Of course, you can still have disagreements about all these types of things. But I think it's important to just talk about the data that we have. So, many of you, I'm sure, heard about the South Carolina execution that happened last week. So we're going to be talking about the death penalty today, capital punishment, whatever you want to call it. And I'll just bring this up. This is from Ground News. Ground News, if you don't know, is like a news aggregate. I like to use it. I don't pay for it. I just get my 5 free stories or whatever. But it's pretty cool. Tells you distribution. You can look at news sources, and it tells you, you know, they're left leaning, right leaning, all sorts of stuff. Cool, right? Um, Anywho, this guy named Keith Sigmund, Brad's Keith Sigmund. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Um, was executed by firing squad in South Carolina on March 10th, 2025 at 6:08. But this execution was the first by firing squad in South Carolina's history. Sigmund was the second death row inmate executed in South Carolina this year, and his lawyer stated his closing statement was one of love and calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. I think by closing statement, this is AI generated. Maybe it means final statement. We're going to look at that, actually. That's what prompted me to do this. We have done, you'll see this first in U.S. in 15 years, that the death row, for those of you who don't know, usually the punishment or the way that death is meted out is through lethal injection. I think most other ways of doing it have dropped out. But South Carolina, I guess, reinstituted the firing squad as an option. There are other states that actually have this as an option. The firing squad is, I know, in Utah. I think the last time it was used was in Utah because Utah allows the inmate to select the way that they would like to die from various different kind of methods or whatever. So there are many states in the United States that still practice the capital punishment. New Jersey, our state does not, right? So you could murder, 1,000 people and not get the death penalty in New Jersey, right? You'll be sentenced to life forever. No way you're getting out, but you're not going to get the death penalty. And of course, this causes a lot of debate in the United States because I do think, again, not an expert here, I do think most Americans support the death penalty. And I would say from a philosophical perspective that even those people who don't support the death penalty support a death penalty. And I would say that if you think that cops should own guns, you support the death penalty. You just, I would philosophically, I would make the case that you just support it in a worse way, because you basically give it up to people who, without a jury, without a trial, without whatever else, are just liable to shoot whoever. Now, I'm not saying that cops shouldn't be armed. That's not what I'm saying. But so often we have these discussions, we often forget that we just inherent in our society allow certain people to allow judge, jury, executioner type of death penalties with the police and things like that. So we always need to keep that into consideration because this can be very heated. Discussions like this, that's not my goal. I don't know much about this case. I think he murdered the parents of his girlfriend, I think it was. And so he was sentenced to death in South Carolina. used the firing squad, and of course, there's all sorts of debate about that. I mean, I was reading down here, just looking at these things. Um, I saw a very, I believe, maybe it was the last time I was on here. Um, you know, there was an actual. Let me see if I can find it. Uh, Title of an article that was very uh, very kind of against the idea of the death penalty. So you can see the National Catholic Reporter, right? South Carolina's firing squad execution magnifies the cruelty of the death penalty. Um, and he was, I guess, he also chose to be executed by firing squad because he believed the alternatives, lethal injection and electrocution, are more horrific. I would agree with him on that. If you gave me a choice, I would choose firing squad over both of those things. But that's neither here nor there. So it's the fact that it was firing squad has set off a whole firestorm of people who think that that's very barbaric and stuff like that. But I wanted to talk about just Sigmund's closing statement, his final statement, and I wanted to talk about what he says in this thing. So this was read by his lawyer, I believe, before he was. It was read aloud by Shane, who I guess is the spokesperson for the Department of Corrections, during a press conference afterward. And so this is it. So I'm going to read it for him, and then we're going to talk about it. So he says, I want my closing statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty. At that time, I was too ignorant to know how wrong that was. Why? Because we no longer live under the Old Testament law, but now live under the New Testament. Matthew 5:38-39 says, You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you that you do not resist an evil person. Whosoever shall smite me on the right cheek, turn to him the other one as well. Romans 6:14, For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are no longer under the law, but under grace. Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man the authority to kill another man. That is why the Bible is divided into the Old Testament and New Testament. Remember the words of Jesus, John 7:19. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keep the law. Keep with the law. We are now under God's grace and mercy. Firstly, I think it is a wonderful and beautiful thing that this man who was a murderer turned to Jesus. And now, I believe completely, despite the evil, the great, horrific, terrible evil that was done on earth, that he, with all the data that I have, is now with Christ in paradise, which is wonderful. I wish I was there too. Not yet, though. But as much as I appreciate my brother's testimony and his words here, that he is willing to say this and call people to do this thing, this is obviously not an easy thing to do. He's dead, and he, of course, did not. Probably knew that people would attack him pretty heavily for this. I'm sure if you find an article on Facebook talking about this, you can hear all sorts of people weighing into this guy or whatever, right? So my idea is not, when I dissect this statement, is not to attack him. He and I just disagree over the biblical data. And I think that many people in the Christian sphere who are opponents of the death penalty often do not take into the full account of the data. We have to be really careful when we get to saying stuff like the death penalty is morally wrong. And that's going to become very clear if you know the Bible and kind of you want to be consistent about the character of God. But first things first, I want to honor him by looking at these passages. And so the first one we're going to look at is Matthew 5:38. This is a very famous passage. We're going to go back to Mark. We're going to look at that in a second. I'm just going to pull this up. So this is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. Just an important note is to remember as an idea with the Sermon on the Mount is that the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus giving law. And that's a big deal because who was the last person to deliver law from a mountain? God, or Jesus, right? God. This is what Matthew's getting at, right? So when Jesus is giving these teachings, he's expounding on the law and he's telling people what they should do. So I'm going to read the full idea just to put it in perspective. So he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone who slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." Now, something I think is really important and true about what Sigmund brings out about this passage is that this is certainly an ethic that Jesus wants us to apply in our personal lives. And I would say that, of course, we don't want to just apply this only in our personal lives. We would like this to be a wider held belief amongst the church and amongst society, right? That this is a good teaching. Jesus is putting into perspective a teaching from the Old Testament that we're going to look at from Leviticus here, that this is that people, Pharisees, scribes, right, people who misunderstood the law, take this to just mean vengeance and retribution. That's all that this means. And so Jesus is telling his followers that they are not to have a heart that desires those things. Instead, they should go the extra mile. A very famous thing that's just entered into the English language from this passage, right? This is the idea that Romans, when they would come, at the time they had the right to conscript civilians to make them carry stuff for them. So he has very much this idea here. It has to do with being personally insulted, things like that. You'll notice that this is not even though these are certainly insights and positive things that we should try and apply on a societal level, this is not Jesus talking about governments or things like that, right? This is about individual Christians and how we should live our lives, right? There should be one of mercy, one of forgiveness, one of reconciliation. Of course, this should be desired at higher levels, but I think the context is pretty important here. And Jesus builds upon this in a lot of other different places. So I wanted to show that one. That's Matthew 5:38. And then he brings up Romans 6:14. Man, this is all over the place today. So this is Paul talking about sin, the law, death, all that sorts of thing, right? He says, "Let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace." Now, when he says this is a topic that Paul is running through here when he says that Christians are no longer under the law. And what that means is that we are not bound by our righteousness being tied to the law anymore. So we don't follow the law to become righteous. Instead, we are under grace, because the law, in Paul's argument, makes us aware of sin. And if we try and make ourselves righteous through the law, then we just continually just go deeper into sin because we are fighting it the wrong way, right? We're just doing, if we're good enough, we just do this enough. And you can see that in Paul's letters and other places, all this, and in the Gospels when Jesus critiques the Pharisees for this idea, right, that what happens is people end up adding on to things or excusing bad behavior, all sorts of things for the sake of following the law, or they diminish the work of God in doing so on the cross, right? And the thing, you can see that this is immediately complicated by what comes after, right? He says, "What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law, but under grace?" By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience that leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that you, who were once slaves to sin, became obedient from the heart of the standard of teaching to which you were committing, and having been set free from sinning, having become slaves of righteousness. So here, right, he's again talking about you're still following teaching and commands, right? That's kind of the thing. The law is still present in what Jesus is doing, but the law as being the thing that gives righteous agent is not there. A lot of debate about this in Pauline studies, by the way. I'm sure you can find people online who might quibble with me in my interpretation there, but I think that's the most consistent way to read it. Next place I want to go is the last place that he went, which is John 7:19. So this whole passage, right, Jesus is speaking to a group of people at the Feast of Booths. I'm going to read the verse, but I think it's important to see it in context as well. Has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? So Jesus is teaching during this time, right? And people don't like what what he has to say. And Jesus is teaching with great authority and learning, and he's never formally studied like the scribes and the Pharisees, so people are pretty shocked by that. He says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God, or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" So again, this isn't Jesus attacking the idea of the law. It's not what's going on here. The idea here is that all these people are speaking for Moses, yet none of them act the way that Moses is calling them to act, right? Why do you seek to kill me? He's not teaching anything contrary to the laws of Moses. Of course, people don't like this. They say, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Which is funny because, like, they're lying, right? They don't like him. And you can see people just above this that people are trying to kill him. They're not a fan of him. So Jesus says to them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers." So just that Moses gave the law about circumcision, and that that but it's really actually from the patriarchs, earlier in Genesis. Anyway, he says, "You circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." And so this is a condemnation of them selectively applying the law to attack Jesus, right? They're not actually following what it commands or the spirit of the law. Instead, they're using it in order to attack Jesus. So Jesus, again, here, not attacking the idea of the law or saying that we should not care about what the Old Testament has to say. He's instead just saying, you guys don't care about it. You're not following what God demands of you, right? But I also think, like, whenever we're having a conversation about the death penalty, we always need to think about the fact that Jesus was unjustly put to death. Like, that is an important caveat here, right? When we think about whether we think it's right or wrong, we have to remember that it is a flawed thing, and that our religion, at the center of it, is the cross and the empty tomb, and the cross is an unjust death sentence on Jesus, right? Jesus did not deserve it, but it is given to him, and God uses that for great healing of the nations, right? But it's not something that we should just kind of brush off. Lots of Christians that I've talked to against the death penalty will bring this idea up, and I think it's worth it to remember. So all I'm going to do here is read just read verse 37 to the end, right? Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So we have to remember that this is a thing that happened, and we can't just say, "Oh, it's always good," right? It's not always good. It can be wrongfully applied, and of course, you see this in the life of the early church, where people are being murdered for believing in Jesus, right? They're being unjustly killed. Um, all right, so that's kind of the statements that are against it. Why I think it, but I think like we can't just look at things that are against it. We have to look at passages that I think are a lot more supportive of it, or challenge this idea that we don't live under the Old Testament law. Um, I think the important thing to remember, or the way that Christians have traditionally understood this, is that we are bound by a lot of the Old Testament law, especially the moral law, right? And actually, this is going to be used all the time in the New Testament to talk about things like sexual immorality, things like that, right? To give ideas about that. But what we aren't bound by are the ritual law um, and the temple laws, because those have been done away with. Uh, so we call that abrogation. So they've been abrogated by a new law coming forward, a new command. And of course, we always have at the heart of what Jesus is teaching many times concerning the law is not that the law is insufficient, but that the law also has a spirit of mercy in it that people forget. Right? I desire mercy and not sacrifice, as Jesus will tell the Pharisees who attack him. But anyway, I want to just look at Matthew 5:17 real quick. So you'll notice that this is just a few verses before the part where it says an eye for an eye, things like that. Jesus says this, and this is really at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, right? He starts with the Beatitudes, and then he says to his disciples that you're salt and light, right? So you have to give glory to God. And then as he's going into giving law, the first thing he says is, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And the idea here is that the scribes and the Pharisees have taken these law principles and they've used them, they've downplayed them, and they've used them as a way to actually do unrighteous things. Right? So what God intends in the spirit of the law, for instance, if we just go down to this, right? You have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. So he quotes the law. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the fires of hell. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come offer your gift. Come to terms with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. So Jesus is not attacking this idea that people who murder aren't going to be liable to judgment, right? That's not Jesus's problem. The problem is that people are not understanding the purpose of the law that was given, which is to not be angry or to hate people, right? That you should try and settle things and not make it come to full account. And so it's not just the fact that it's not just killing something, you can't even be angry at them. He does the same thing with lust, right? It's not just that you are committing adultery. It's not the physical act that is the most important thing, right? It's where your heart is. And that's what God desires continually in the Old Testament when he talks about the law, right? It's not the circumcision of the flesh that matters. It's the circumcision of the heart. That's the Old Testament, not the New Testament. You'll notice one of the things is that we spend so much time in the New Testament, we often forget how much of this is just taken from the Old Testament, which doesn't surprise us at all because the law and the prophets point to Jesus, as he points out here. So when we say something like it's not about eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth, or whatever anymore, um, that's not necessarily true. It actually does matter still to us, right? The reason that law was put in place, the spirit behind it, right? Just to go back to there, that's not that it's a bad principle. It's actually meant to keep people from over retaliating. That's the idea of the eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth. Is because in our culture and in many others, it's not just that you want justice for a lot of people, it's that you want justice and then some. Look at the current state of civil litigation in the United States with all the lawsuits and everything like that, right? Do we really think that in some of these cases when someone gets hurt, that it's actually, you slip and fall in Walmart, and of course you're in pain, and you break your leg, and maybe you can never use it again, in the sense of like in the same way? Is it really worth $10 million for that? I mean, if you're a lawyer, you're going to say absolutely, right? But when we think about eye for eye, tooth for tooth type of thing, is that the actual equivalent for that? This is where we could get into debate and stuff like that. The idea here, though, all I'm saying is that the eye and eye, tooth for tooth statement used not just in the Bible but in other ancient legal literature is to keep people from going above and beyond in their attacks or damage to someone, right? And so Jesus is saying here that the spirit of that law is not that you retaliate against someone. That's not the idea, right? The idea of that law is instead that just things happen, but you're not supposed to have a spirit of vengeance or retaliation, which is what he goes on to tell people not to do. All right, so then we're going to go to Leviticus 24:17, and of course this is the problem, right? If you go as far as some people to just say that the death penalty is completely immoral, you run into real problems because God institutes it, right? We're going to just look at the passage where this is taken from. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done it, shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And so this actually comes within the passage of blasphemy. So someone who blasphemes the name of God, and Moses says this, right? And this is the law about this. This is called lex talionis in Latin, law of retribution, or the similar punishment. Now, this right here, I should say, is in the passage itself and elsewhere in Scripture, not meant to be taken literally, even in the book of Leviticus, when it comes to, oh, literally, if they lose an eye, you have to lose an eye too. Like, that's not how it's applied. Pretty much all this falls under what we would call, I guess in modern day, tort law, right? So if you harm someone, you're expected to recompense them. But with great moral crimes, the death penalty is allowed, and carried out. So this person who blasphemes God's name in the presence of everyone is stoned in this passage by the other Israelites and by Moses, right? And so they stone him with stones, as it says. Thus the people of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses. The idea here is that there is no recompense that this guy can pay to God in this instance, right? That this is the appropriate punishment for it. And actually, all over the Old Testament, you'll see death as kind of the not all over, in the law, you see death as kind of the ultimate thing. And I noted in my sermon about this that this is often the maximum penalty, not the mandated one. Here, it's mandated, as a show of this is an important thing. But there are other points where laws that would lead to a death penalty are not actually carried out in such a way, both in the Old and New Testaments, because this is a maximum idea of a sentence. So maybe there would be some cases where it does demand that, but probably most cases as they were handled in the Old Testament, it doesn't demand it. But here, right, it does say that God at least thinks that this is an acceptable punishment for someone who takes a life, right? That they can and shall surely be put to death. This is actually a much stronger statement than you see in other places. And that's because God really cares about the image of God. And of course, when you kill someone, you cannot get any recompense for that. They're gone forever, and then you have to take into account all the things that could have happened in their life that have also died with that. Very hard to quantify that, and so God takes the shedding of blood very seriously and holds that accountable. The last thing I want to point out is that he states that nowhere in the New Testament does God give man the authority to kill someone else, and that's, I would say, not true. So in Romans 13, Paul is talking about the government, and he says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Something to note, this is obviously a complicated passage, because people will say, well, does this mean we have to do whatever the government tells you? No. Paul is actually in prison when he writes this, right? But it's about it's knowing what the purpose of the government is, and so if the government is forcing you to give up your Christian identity or to not follow what you think Christ is calling you to do, then you, like Paul, kind of respectfully uh, get arrested. You live out what you're doing, you get arrested, you appeal, you fight against it. But the overall view of the Christian view of government is that it's a good thing that's been set up to punish evil. And the sword is used here as the death penalty, right? So Paul here is saying that it's actually a positive thing. And this is really interesting because Paul himself will be killed by the Roman authorities. At least that's what Christian tradition holds. But he certainly would be aware of all the other authorities or Christians that have been killed by governors or things like that, or through persecution. So this is a pretty interesting passage when you look at it in that context. He's not against the idea of people being judged through capital punishment. It's mostly just that it should be applied rightly to those people who deserve it. And so this really makes it a pretty tricky thing, right, when we're talking about data in the Bible when it comes to theology, right? Some Christian churches have taken stances against the death penalty, and some, like the Anabaptists, have always had a stance against it. The Catholic Church has revised its stance on it in the recent decades. They now take a negative view on it. I'm sure, kind of tongue-in-cheekly, I'm sure for the reformers and other people, they're glad, that they did that. It just came a few centuries too late, right? Because, of course, up until very recently, the Catholic Church was fine with the death penalty, and they even condemned people to death in councils and such, right? So I think some of this is a little modernistic in a viewpoint. But we need to take seriously the idea that God cares about people's lives. And we need to take seriously the idea of mercy. I mean, we can't just say, this is what's always going to happen in every circumstance, right? We need to have flexibility that the spirit of the law demands from us. But we also can't downplay it or get rid of the parts of it that we don't like, because we have to take God's word seriously. And so I appreciate Sigmund's call to us, even if I disagree with it. I think this is a good way to have conversations about it, and not let it devolve into politics. Like, my party says that this is the right thing, so that's what I say. but rather what does God have to say about it, and how do we handle that in a way that's appropriate and honoring to God and honoring to people made in His image, both those who are murdered and those who are the murderers, because that is what we are called to do. So I hope you guys found this interesting, and I will be gone this weekend, but I'll see you next week for Bible study and another episode of A New Thing. So I hope you guys enjoy our True Reformation Sunday service, and I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.